It's an honor to be here today, and I want to start off with a little story that one or two of you I know will find very familiar. It's about the Jewish chap who was shipwrecked on a desert island. And he was there for years and years without any hope of rescue. And finally, several years later, he spotted a ship in the distance. He lit a fire. He sent up a signal, and the ship came to rescue him from the desert island. And before he went off on the ship back to civilization, he invited the captain of the ship to see what he'd built on his desert island over those years. So he showed him the house that he'd built and all the ingenious things he'd made out of leaves and sticks and stones so that he could live on the island. And then along the beach he showed him a rather fine structure built of palm leaves and wood. And he said, "This is my synagogue. I built this synagogue for myself on the island to worship." And the captain was looking at this with great admiration, and he looked further along the beach, and there was another structure that looked just the same, built of wood and palm leaves, rather beautiful. And he said to the chap, and what's that over there? Is that another synagogue? He said, "That synagogue? I wouldn't be seen dead going into that synagogue." So this is a nice joke that Jews are fond of telling one another about the divisions within our community, because indeed we have many divisions: liberal, orthodox, reform, Masorti, and numerous other different kinds of synagogues, depending on how traditional, how liberal, how progressive, etc. People in the Jewish community are. But this illustrates a truth about religions generally. I doubt that any of us from any religious tradition could say that there aren't similar kinds of divisions within our community. There are different strands, different teachings, different styles of worship, and we tend to be vociferous. We tend to split apart, and you mentioned that in your talk, Pejman. That's the nature of human beings, that over time different approaches arise and we split apart. And with religions generally, I suppose, it's the same tendency. Throughout much of history, the tendency of religions has been to separate from one another, to say ours is the correct way of worshipping God, we have a special relationship with God, if indeed we believe in a personal God. Some religions don't. And building the walls up and keeping separate, tests of belief or practice for belonging or being an outsider, and as you said, us and them. And this has been, for most of our human history, the character of religions. From time to time, there have been attempts to come together in dialogue, in discussion, but more often than not, it's been hostile rather than friendly. So what we're engaged in here is a rather new occurrence in human history. Since the 19th century, since the World Congress of Faiths was established, since interfaith groups began to grow up in this country in the 1920s, for dialogue especially between Jews and Christians, there's been a huge new flowering. And how has that come about? Well, I want to suggest one of the chief impulses has been the rise of secular society, secular liberal society, since the 18th, 19th century, as one of the key factors of modernity. It has been the challenge to religion from secularism, from atheism, that has helped religions to begin to look at one another in a different light, to try to establish what we have in common rather than all the things that separate us. It's a wonderful thing. For me, in my life, interfaith dialogue has been one of my most passionate commitments, and it seems to me that it's where God is calling us at this time in our history. But it wouldn't happen without the challenge of a secular society out there which questions all religious beliefs and values, and traditional religious authority telling people how they should live, who they can marry, what they should eat, where they should go, and so forth. And there's a tendency that I've encountered many times over my years of interfaith dialogue to cast the secular world as the enemy. We religious people must band together because there is a hostile secular world out there that is attacking all of us. And we know that there is a secular world that is attacking all of us. There's a sort of militant, dogmatic atheism, the Dawkins tendency, the Hitchens tendency, which condemns all religion as delusion, as folly, as something harmful to humanity. We who have faith commitments know that we're not harmful to humanity, quite the contrary. We plumb the very depths of what it means to be human and to establish human ethical, moral, and spiritual values. But at the same time, we need to take those challenges seriously. I think as religions, we should try not to approach the secular world in a spirit of hostility and rejection, but rather try to establish the same kinds of bonds between religious and secular as we are trying so hard to establish among ourselves, among different religions. There was a great, great rabbi called Rav Kook in the early 20th century. He lived in Palestine, and he was faced by the secularism, often quite militant, communist secularism of much of the Jewish community in Palestine at the time. And he tried to build bridges with the secular, between the religious. He was a deeply mystical, spiritual, deeply orthodox rabbinic leader. But he put forward the view, which I've found very inspiring, that in a way we, the religious, need that secular world. We need that approach that questions whether there is even a God, or indeed says there is no God. Because what we as religious people tend to do, he said, is make our God into an idol, because we insist that God has a particular name, a particular character, a particular identity. Our God is not like your God, etc., etc. And as soon as we try to limit God and say, we know God, we know what God is, we know what God likes to be called, we know exactly how God wants to be prayed to, and it's not the way you're doing it, then God becomes an idol. So he said, the secular world is there to challenge us, to challenge our insular, limited conceptions of the divine, and to help break that down, to break down those idolatrous tendencies that, he said, arose in Judaism, and I think are there in all religious traditions. And to remind us that God is greater than all of that. Allahu Akbar, as Muslims say. God is greater than any limitation, any human conception that we create. However beautiful our traditions, our prayers, our religious language and symbolism is, it's still limited. And part of the benefit of interfaith dialogue for ourselves is to remind ourselves constantly that God is greater than any one religion, and God can be encountered, or the divine, if you don't want to say God in a personal sense, the divine, the holy, the supreme can be encountered through all of these different symbols, languages, names, ways of worship that all of us share. And so I think that is the challenge of the secular world, and why we should try to build bridges with that secular world and help to, through our unity, through our friendship, to show religion is a helpful and not a harmful force for humanity. Thank you.
Thank you.